I stood on the front porch of our cozy suburban home, gripping a bouquet of white roses in one hand and a small gift box in the other. The late spring air smelled sweet, mingling with the faint aroma of Helen's favorite vanilla candles wafting through the open kitchen window. This was our life, a picture-perfect 10-year marriage. Or so I thought. Helen and I met in college, a storybook romance, everyone said. She was all I ever wanted. Intelligent, funny, beautiful in that understated way that made her elegance seem effortless. Over the years, I never doubted her. We had our moments, sure, like any couple. But Helen was my rock, and I prided myself on being hers. Trust wasn't just a foundation in our marriage. It was the air we breathed. She was home when I walked in, standing by the stove, humming softly. She turned and smiled, her auburn hair catching the golden sunlight streaming through the kitchen. "White roses. You remembered," she said, coming over to kiss me on the cheek. "Of course," I replied, my heart swelling with affection. 10 years today. I couldn't forget even if I tried. Dinner was perfect. Helen had gone all out. Her famous lasagna, garlic bread, and the bottle of red wine we'd been saving. We toasted to us, to the future, to growing old together. But there was something faintly off, a subtle distance in her gaze when she thought I wasn't looking. I dismissed it as nothing, chalking it up to the exhaustion of raising 2 kids and keeping a house running while I worked long hours. It wasn't until a week later that things began to unravel. I had taken up badminton as a casual hobby, an excuse to get out of the office and get active. Helen encouraged it. "You need something just for you," she had said, and even insisted I hire a private coach to help me improve. Her support felt genuine, or maybe I just wanted it to be. The coach, Paul, was charming and laid back, the kind of guy who got along with everyone. He worked mostly with women in the neighborhood, and Helen sometimes joked about how all the husbands secretly envied his easy charisma. "You're not jealous, are you, Tyler?" she'd tease, her laugh ringing like a bell. Of course I wasn't. I had no reason to be. Or so I thought. That night, as I lay in bed, Helen beside me scrolling through her phone, I felt the first seed of doubt. A text alert pinged on her screen, and she quickly tilted the phone away. It wasn't her reaction that bothered me. It was the faint flush of her cheeks. My chest tightened, but I told myself not to overthink it. After all, this was Helen. My Helen. But as the days passed, small inconsistencies began to surface. Helen started spending more time out, claiming she was meeting friends or running errands. There were late-night phone calls, always hushed. And then there was her newfound interest in my badminton games. She would linger longer than usual, asking questions about my sessions with Paul. "You're really improving," she'd say, her smile warm but her eyes searching. Something gnawed at me, faint but persistent, a splinter under the skin, and then it hit me. Helen wasn't just interested in my lessons. She was interested in Paul. I couldn't sleep that night. Helen's smile, the way it didn't quite reach her eyes, kept replaying in my mind. I hated myself for even entertaining the thought. I mean, this was Helen, my wife, the mother of our kids. Yet I couldn't shake the gnawing doubt that something was amiss. The next morning, I poured myself a cup of coffee and tried to shake off the unease. Helen was cheerful as ever, humming to herself while packing lunches for the kids. She kissed me on the cheek before I left for work, her usual goodbye of, "Love you, honey," echoing in my ears. It was normal, too normal, like she was trying to smooth over invisible wrinkles. At work, I couldn't focus. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, flushed, nervous, tilting her phone away like she had something to hide. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was losing my mind. But the rational part of me, the part that made spreadsheets for fun, told me that I wasn't imagining things. That evening, I decided to casually bring up Paul. We were sitting on the couch after dinner, Helen scrolling through Instagram while the kids played upstairs. "So, Paul says I'm getting better with my backhand," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. Helen looked up, her smile immediate but just a hair too bright. "That's great. I knew you'd enjoy badminton once you got into it." "Yeah, he's a good coach," I continued. "You've met him a few times, haven't you?" She nodded, setting her phone down. "At the community center. He's nice. Everyone says he's the best in town." Her voice was steady, but her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her shirt. My stomach churned. Yeah, he's popular, I said. Funny though. The other day, he mentioned he'd seen you around recently. I didn't realize you were at the center. Her head snapped up, and for a split second, her face froze. Oh, she said, forcing a laugh. I might have run into him while dropping off snacks for the kids' practice. You know how busy things get. I nodded, pretending to accept her answer, but the crack in her armor was glaring. Something wasn't right. That night, I called my best friend Nate. If anyone could talk me down from my spiraling thoughts, it was him. Tyler, man, you're overthinking this, Nate said after I explained everything. Helen's not like that. She adores you. I know, I muttered, running a hand through my hair. I just can't shake this feeling. She's been acting different. Well, Nate said carefully, if you're really worried, maybe you should do some digging, just to put your mind at ease. Digging like what? I asked, though the idea was already forming in my head. Nothing crazy. Just pay attention. Look for patterns. If she's hiding something, you'll notice. By the time I hung up, my heart was racing. Nate had said exactly what I needed to hear. I wasn't going to accuse Helen of anything without proof. But if something was happening, I wasn't going to sit idly by. Over the next week, I started observing Helen more closely. The way she lingered over her phone when she thought I wasn't looking. The sudden bursts of energy to run errands at odd hours. And then there was the perfume, one I didn't recognize, floral and sweet, lingering faintly on her clothes when she came home. The final straw came the following Saturday. I was heading out for my lesson with Paul when I noticed Helen had already left. She didn't say where she was going, but her absence felt deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was avoiding me. After practice, I stopped by the community center office to grab some water. The receptionist, a sweet older woman named Linda, greeted me with her usual warmth. Hey, Linda, I said casually. Has Helen been around here much? Linda's brow furrowed, her eyes flicking to me with curiosity. Oh, yes. She's been volunteering a lot lately. It's wonderful to see her so involved. My stomach dropped. Volunteering? I asked, my voice tight. Linda smiled. With Paul's programs. They seem to work so well together. You must be proud of her. I smiled back, but it felt like my face might crack under the strain. Yeah, proud. I mumbled, grabbing my water and leaving as quickly as I could. The drive home was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Volunteering. With Paul. And she hadn't mentioned a word of it. That night, after Helen had gone to bed, I sat in the living room, staring at the anniversary photos on the mantel. The love in her eyes seemed so real. But was it? Or had she been lying to me this whole time? It was time to find out the truth. By the time I had decided to act, the knot in my stomach had tightened into something unbearable. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. There was a pattern I couldn't ignore. Helen was hiding something, and I needed. Part 3. The discovery. By the time I decided to act, the knot in my stomach had tightened into something unbearable. This wasn't just paranoia anymore. There was a pattern I couldn't ignore. Helen was hiding something, and I needed to know the truth. I remember Nate's advice about looking for patterns. But the situation called for more than just passive observation. If Helen wouldn't tell me the truth, I'd have to find it myself. The next day, while she was out running errands, I took my chance. Her phone was charging on the kitchen counter. Normally, I wouldn't have touched it. It was an unspoken rule in our relationship to respect each other's privacy. But this wasn't a normal situation. With shaky hands, I picked up the phone. It was locked, of course, but I knew Helen's passcode. It was our anniversary date. My chest tightened as I entered the numbers, and her home screen lit up. A flood of guilt hit me, but I pushed it aside. Whatever was on this phone might save me from the torment of not knowing. I scrolled through her messages, emails, and social media, but everything seemed innocent. For a moment, I thought I was being ridiculous, letting my insecurities get the better of me. But then I noticed an app one didn't recognize, a secure messaging app called Signal. My heart pounded as I opened it. There was a conversation with a contact saved under a single letter. P. The thread was filled with casual exchanges about badminton practice, volunteering at the center, and other seemingly harmless topics. But the tone was too familiar, too playful. It wasn't how you'd talk to a colleague or friend. My chest tightened further as I scrolled up, looking for something concrete. Then I found it. A message from Helen. Last night was perfect. I can't stop thinking about it. When can we meet again? I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My vision blurred as I stared at the screen, the words swimming in front of me. I read it again and again, hoping I'd misinterpreted it, but there was no mistaking what it meant. My hands trembled as I continued scrolling. More messages. Plans to meet. Flirty exchanges. Inside jokes that clearly went beyond badminton. And then, the nail in the coffin. A photo Helen had sent of herself in the dress she'd worn to our anniversary dinner, captioned, "What do you think?" Too much. The date on the message matched the night before our anniversary. I dropped the phone like it was burning my hand. My mind raced, a storm of anger, hurt, and disbelief. Helen, my wife of 10 years, the woman I had trusted with my life, had betrayed me. And not just with anyone, with Paul, the man I had trusted to help me with my newfound hobby. The irony was bitter. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at nothing. My mind replayed every interaction, every moment Helen and Paul had been in the same room. Every laugh, every glance, every time I trusted them both without question. How long had it been going on? How could I have been so blind? By the time Helen came home, I had composed myself. I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed more proof. And I needed a plan. That night, while Helen slept soundly beside me, I texted Nate. "You were right," I wrote. "Something's going on." I found proof. His reply was immediate. "I'm coming over tomorrow. We'll figure this out." I stared at Helen's sleeping form, her chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. She looked so serene, so innocent. But the truth was out now. The woman I loved, the woman I had built a life with, was living a lie. And soon, she would know that I knew. The next morning, Helen went about her usual routine, making breakfast, helping the kids get ready for school, and humming to herself as though everything was perfect. I played along, masking the storm brewing inside me with forced smiles and casual conversation. If she sensed anything was wrong, she didn't show it. By noon, it was at my house. He didn't say much at first, just gave me a firm pat on the back and a look that told me he was ready for whatever came next. We sat in the living room, the curtains drawn, hashing out a plan. "I'm not going to confront her until I have everything," I told him. "I don't want her to have any way to talk her way out of this." Nate nodded. "Smart. You need something irrefutable, and you need a way to hit her where it hurts." I thought about Helen's messages, the flirting, and that photo. It still made my stomach churn. "It's not just her," I said quietly. "It's him too. Paul. He's gotten away with this long enough." "Well," Nate said, leaning back with a wry smile, "then let's make sure he doesn't." We started by outlining how to collect more evidence. I had already uncovered the texts and the photo, but we needed something undeniable, something that would leave no room for lies or manipulation. Nate suggested a bold idea, planting a recording device in her car. "It's not like we're going to use it in court," he said. "This is for you, to hear it from her own mouth." I agreed, and by the afternoon, Nate and I had discreetly installed a voice recorder under the driver's seat of Helen's car. It would capture any conversations she had while driving, especially ones with Paul. Next, we turned our attention to the anniversary celebration Helen had planned for us that weekend. She had been oddly enthusiastic about it, insisting on a fancy dinner at a private venue. At first, I thought it was just her way of trying to rekindle something in our marriage. Now, I wondered if it was something else entirely, a way to ease her guilt or a charade to keep up appearances. "Use it to your advantage," Nate said. "If Paul's involved, they'll get sloppy. People always do when they think they're in the clear." The idea made me sick, but he was right. The dinner would be the perfect opportunity to see what they were up to. For the next few days, I kept up the facade of a loving husband. I complimented Helen on her cooking, laughed at her jokes, and even helped her pick out a dress for the dinner. Inside, I was simmering with anger and heartbreak, but I held it together. The recorder in her car would give me the answers I needed, and the anniversary dinner would be the stage for what came next. By Friday evening, I had more than enough to confirm my suspicions. The recorder captured everything. Conversations about meeting up, planning excuses, and even a heated exchange where Helen worried I might suspect something. Paul had reassured her, laughing. Tyler's too trusting. He'll never figure it out. Listening to his smug voice made my blood boil. But I stayed calm. I wasn't going to let my emotions ruin what I had planned. On the night of the dinner, Helen was radiant. She wore the same dress from the photo she'd sent to Paul, a sleek, dark green number that hugged her curves. As she twirled in front of the mirror, she looked at me with a warm smile. "How do I look?" she asked. "Stunning," I replied, forcing myself to smile back. We arrived at the venue, a cozy, intimate restaurant Helen had chosen. Everything was perfect, the lighting, the music, the table set just for us. But as the night went on, I noticed Helen checking her phone more than usual. Her laughter seemed forced, her eyes darting to the door every time it opened. Then, halfway through dessert, Paul walked in. I watched as Helen's face lit up, her cheeks flushing with a mix of excitement and panic. Paul didn't come over to the table, of course. He sat at the bar, pretending not to notice us, but it was clear they had coordinated this. I felt the betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut, but I kept my cool. This was what I had been waiting for. Nate was in the parking lot, waiting for my signal. I texted him a single word: now. It was time to bring everything crashing down. Helen was radiant, laughing softly as she toyed with her glass of wine. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, though, and I could see the tension she was trying to hide. Her phone sat face down on the table, but she glanced at it now and then, almost instinctively. The air between us felt like a taut wire, ready to snap. I leaned back in my chair, swirling my whiskey. "It's a perfect night," I said, my tone deliberately casual. "You really outdid yourself with the dinner plans." She smiled, her voice sweet. "I wanted it to be special. 10 years deserves a little extra effort." I nodded, my stomach twisting. I couldn't decide what hurt more, the lie in her words or the fact that she believed I was oblivious. I glanced toward the bar where Paul sat, pretending to study the menu, but stealing glances at Helen when he thought I wasn't looking. The nerve of him, to show up here tonight, was almost laughable. They thought they were clever, but they had no idea what was coming. Nate's text buzzed in my pocket. "Ready when you are." I didn't respond immediately. Timing was everything. Instead, I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "You know, Helen, these 10 years really have been something. We've built a life together of family memories. Trust. That's the foundation, don't you think?" Her smile faltered, just for a second. "Of course," she said, her voice steady but just a little too rehearsed. "Trust is everything." "Good," I said, leaning back and taking a slow sip of my drink. "I agree. That's why I have a little surprise for you tonight." Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, I saw the flicker of excitement I used to adore. But beneath it, there was something else: uncertainty. "What kind of surprise?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. "You'll see," I replied, standing. "But first, I think we should invite our friend at the bar to join us. After all, he's been such a big part of our lives lately." Helen's face went pale. "What? What are you talking about?" I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and gestured toward Paul. "Hey, Coach, why don't you come over and join us? It's a celebration, after all." Paul froze, his hand gripping the edge of the bar. He looked at Helen, then at me, his expression a mix of confusion and panic. Helen's voice was tight, almost a whisper. "Tyler, what are you doing?" "What am I doing?" I echoed, turning back to her. "I'm just being a good husband, Helen. Inviting the man who's clearly been such a prominent figure in your life to join us." "Don't be rude now." Paul stood reluctantly, his shoulders tense as he approached the table. I motioned to the empty chair. "Have a seat." He sat, his movements stiff. "Tyler, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," he started, but I held up a hand to stop him. "No need to explain, Paul. I understand everything perfectly." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Helen's eyes widened as I tapped the screen, playing the recording from her car. Her voice filled the air, clear as day. "Last night was perfect. I can't stop thinking about it. When can we meet again?" Helen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Paul's face turned an alarming shade of red. The other diners around us began to murmur, their attention shifting toward our table. "Do you want me to keep playing?" I asked, my voice cold. "Or maybe we should switch to the texts. I've got plenty of those too." Helen stammered, "Tyler, I can explain." I laughed, sharp and bitter. "Explain? Oh, I'd love to hear it. Go ahead, Helen. Tell me how you've been sneaking around with this guy while I've been breaking my back to give you the life you wanted." Paul stood abruptly. "I should go." "Oh, you're not going anywhere," I snapped, my voice low but deadly. "Sit down." He hesitated, then sank back into the chair, his gaze darting around the room like a trapped animal. "This isn't just about you two," I continued, my voice rising slightly. "You've both made a mockery of everything I've worked for. But don't worry, you'll get what's coming to you. Both of you." I turned to Helen, my voice quiet but razor-sharp. "You wanted a fresh start, didn't you? Well, you're going to get one. Starting tonight." Her lip quivered, but she didn't say anything. I stood, pulling a small envelope from my pocket and tossing it on the table. "That's the number for my lawyer. Consider this my anniversary gift to you." Without waiting for a response, I walked out of the restaurant. Nate was waiting outside, leaning against his car. He grinned as I approached. "That looked intense. You okay?" "Better than I've been in months," I said, my voice firm. "But this isn't over." "Not yet." I had more plans for Helen and Paul. Plans that would ensure they'd feel the full weight of what they'd done. And I wouldn't stop until they both had nothing left. By the time I got home that night, the house felt eerily quiet, like the calm before a storm. I sat in the living room, staring at the family photos on the mantel. Helen and I at our wedding, beaming with joy. The kids' school pictures, all lined up like little milestones in our life together. The weight of what I had just done settled on me, but instead of regret, I felt something close to relief. For the first time in weeks, I was in control. My phone buzzed. A text from Nate. "You did good tonight. Let me know when you're ready for the next step." I stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back, "Tomorrow." The next morning, Helen was already awake when I came downstairs. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale, her eyes rimmed with red. She must have been crying all night. For a split second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Tyler," she began, her voice trembling. "Please let me explain." I held up a hand. "Don't. I don't want to hear it." She flinched, tears welling up in her eyes. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." Like what?" I snapped, my voice sharp enough to cut glass. "You didn't mean to get caught? Or you didn't mean to destroy everything we built together?" She broke down, her shoulders shaking as sobs racked her body. But I didn't move to comfort her. Not this time. I'd been the fool long enough. "I loved you, Helen," I said, my voice quieter now, but no less firm. "I gave you everything, and you threw it all away for what? A fling with my coach? A few stolen moments?" "It wasn't just that," she choked out. I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did. And then I couldn't stop." I laughed bitterly. "Couldn't stop? You mean you didn't want to? Don't try to play the victim here. You made your choices." Her sobs grew louder, but I turned away. I had more important things to focus on than her tears. Later that day, Nate and I put the next part of the plan into action. Paul had been working as a private coach for years, building a solid reputation among the local community. His client list was almost exclusively made up of women, and their husbands trusted him implicitly. Or at least they had. We started by spreading the word. Nate was well-connected, and within hours, the whispers began. Paul had been involved in a scandal with one of his married clients. We didn't name names, but the implication was clear. By the end of the day, half of his clients had canceled their sessions. The other half would follow soon enough. That evening, I sat back and watched as the chaos unfolded. Social media was alive with speculation, the local gossip mill working overtime. Paul's perfect little world was crumbling, and it was only the beginning. Helen, meanwhile, was spiraling. She'd always relied on me to handle the practicalities of life, bills, schedules, decisions. Now, with the threat of divorce looming, she was adrift. I had already contacted my lawyer and begun the process of separating our finances. Helen had no income of her own. She hadn't worked since the kids were born. Everything she had, everything we had, was tied to me. By the end of the week, I had moved out of our bedroom and into the guest room. Helen spent her nights pacing the halls, pleading with me to talk, to forgive her, to give her another chance. But I didn't waver. My resolve was steel, and her tears couldn't touch it. Then came the final blow. A few days later, I received a call from Paul. His voice was tight with desperation. "Tyler, man, we need to talk." "Oh, now you want to talk?" I said, letting the venom seep into my words. "After everything? Look, I know I screwed up, okay? But this has gone too far. People are pulling their contracts. My reputation's ruined. And whose fault is that, Paul?" I cut him off. "You thought you could sneak around with my wife and walk away unscathed? You were wrong." There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Please, Tyler, I'm begging you. Call them off." I laughed, cold and sharp. "You reap what you sow, Paul. Consider this your lesson in consequences." I hung up, satisfied. Paul's career was in shambles, and Helen's world was unraveling. But I wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot. That evening, I sat down with Helen one last time. I slid a folder across the table. Papers outlining the divorce, a detailed list of our assets and my terms. "You'll get nothing," I said bluntly. "No alimony. No support. The house is mine. You can go back to your mother's." Her eyes widened in shock. "You can't do this." "Oh, I can. And I will," I said, my voice hard. "You wanted freedom, Helen. Now you've got it. Enjoy it." She stared at me, her face crumbling as the reality of her situation sank in. For the first time, I saw true regret in her eyes. But it was too late for that now. "Sign the papers," I said, standing, "or fight me in court. Either way, you lose." I left her there, broken and silent. As I walked out of the house, the weight of betrayal finally began to lift. I was done being the victim. Now I was taking my life back. Helen didn't sign the divorce papers immediately. I had expected as much. Instead, she spent the next few days alternating between tearful apologies and bouts of anger, begging me to reconsider 1 minute and lashing out the next. But I didn't waver. Every time she brought it up, I told her the same thing. "You made this choice. Now you live with it." Meanwhile, the whispers about Paul had grown into a full-blown scandal. Word spread quickly among his clients, most of whom were married women. The idea that he'd been involved with a client, a married client, was enough to send the husbands into a quiet fury. One by one, they pulled their wives out of his sessions. By the end of the week, Paul had lost nearly every client he had. I'd heard through Nate that Paul was scrambling to salvage what little was left of his reputation. He'd sent out emails to his clients, pleading his innocence and claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But the damage was done. His name was mud in the community, and no one wanted to take the risk of being associated with him. The private coaching business he'd spent years building was crumbling beneath him. At home, Helen's life was unraveling even faster. Without an income of her own, she was entirely dependent on me. I had frozen our joint accounts and moved my money to a private account. The utilities and the mortgage were still covered, for now, but Helen's spending power was gone. She couldn't buy groceries without asking me for money. She couldn't pay for anything without my approval. I saw the cracks forming in her composure. She tried to act like she could handle it, like she didn't need me, but I knew better. Helen had always been fiercely independent in spirit, but she had grown comfortable relying on me for everything else. Now that safety net was gone, and it showed. One night, she cornered me in the kitchen, her face a mask of desperation. "Tyler, please," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't do this alone. I made a mistake, but I'm still your wife. We can fix this." I stared at her, the woman I had once loved more than anything. She looked so small now, so fragile. But my heart was hardened. "You stopped being my wife the moment you chose him," I said coldly. "You made your bed, Helen. Now lie in it." Her shoulders sagged, and for a moment, I thought she might break down. But then she straightened, her eyes flashing with anger. "You're punishing me," she hissed. "You're doing this because you can't handle the fact that you weren't enough." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "No, Ellen. I'm doing this because you betrayed me. You don't get to play the victim here." She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a moment, letting the anger wash over me, then fade. It was almost satisfying watching her try to fight back and fail. Almost. 2 weeks later, Helen finally caved. I came home to find her sitting at the dining table, the divorce papers in front of her. Her hands trembled as she signed each page, her eyes brimming with tears. "Is this what you wanted?" she whispered as she pushed the papers toward me. "To ruin me?" "No," I said, taking the papers and tucking them into my briefcase. "That's just a bonus." She flinched, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered the texts, the lies, and the betrayal. Whatever Helen was feeling now, she had brought it on herself. "You'll need to be out of the house by the end of the month," I said, my tone flat. "You can stay with your mother." She stared at me, her lips trembling. "You're really going to kick me out? After everything we've been through?" "Yes," I said simply, "because everything we've been through clearly didn't mean anything to you." Her shoulders sagged, and she nodded, defeated. "Fine," she said softly. "I'll go." By the end of the month, Helen was gone. She moved back in with her mother, a stern woman who, as it turned out, was well aware of Helen's infidelity. I heard through the grapevine that their relationship had grown tense, Helen's mother making no effort to hide her disappointment. Without the safety and comfort of our marriage, Helen's life quickly fell apart. She struggled to find work, her resume a decade out of date. Her social circle evaporated almost overnight, her friends distancing themselves from the scandal. She was isolated, vulnerable, and entirely at the mercy of her own choices. Paul, too, had been forced to leave town. His reputation was unsalvageable, and no one in the area was willing to hire him. The last I heard, he was working at a run-down gym in a neighboring city, barely scraping by. For me, life moved forward. The divorce had been a painful process, but in the end, it was liberating. I focused on my kids, my career, and rebuilding the life Helen had nearly destroyed. I wasn't the same man I had been before all this. Not by a long shot. But I was stronger, wiser, and ready to leave the past behind. Helen and Paul had taken everything they could from me, but I had taken it all back, and then some. The house felt emptier without Helen, but it was a relief more than anything else. I didn't have to listen to her excuses, endure her fake smiles, or pretend that everything was okay. The kids, thankfully, were too young to grasp the full weight of what had happened. I had explained the separation as gently as I could, framing it as a decision that would be better for everyone. They missed their mom, of course, but they adjusted quickly to the new normal. Helen, on the other hand, wasn't adjusting so well. It didn't take long for the news of her move back to her mother's house to spread. The whispers started. Friends, acquaintances, and even strangers in our small community speculated about why she had left. The story of her affair with Paul had become the worst-kept secret in town. Helen was no longer the charming, well-liked woman she once was. She was now the subject of judgmental stares and whispered conversations at the grocery store. One day, I got a call from her mother, Elaine. She was a no-nonsense woman, the kind who had never hesitated to speak her mind. "Tyler," she began, her tone sharp, "I need to talk to you about Helen." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "What about her?" "She's not handling this well," Elaine said bluntly. "She spends most of her time crying or locked in her room. She hasn't even tried to look for a job. It's like she's given up. And what exactly do you want me to do about that?" I asked, my voice laced with irritation. "This isn't my problem anymore, Elaine. She made her choices." "I know," Elaine said, her voice softening. "But she's still the mother of your children. I'm not asking you to take her back. I wouldn't if I were you. But maybe you could talk to her. Help her figure out what to do next." I almost laughed at the absurdity of the suggestion. Talk to her? After everything she'd done? But I bit back my sarcasm. "I'll think about it," I said, ending the call before she could press further. I didn't call Helen. I couldn't bring myself to. But I did hear about her struggles through mutual friends. She had applied for a few jobs, but hadn't gotten any offers. Her lack of recent work experience was a glaring red flag for potential employers. Without income, she relied entirely on her mother's charity. And Elaine, while willing to provide a roof over her head, wasn't exactly an endless well of compassion. It wasn't long before the cracks in their relationship began to show. I heard through Nate that Elaine had confronted Helen one night, accusing her of throwing away a good marriage for a man who had now abandoned her. "You had it all," Elaine had reportedly said. "A husband who loved you, a stable home, a family, and you destroyed it for what? A fling with some coach." Helen had tried to defend herself, but Elaine wasn't having it. "Don't you dare try to justify this. You've embarrassed yourself, your children, and this family." The words must have stung because after that, Helen stopped speaking to her mother altogether, retreating even further into her shell. Paul's life wasn't any better. He'd been blacklisted in the local community, and no one was willing to hire him. He'd relocated to a neighboring town, but the whispers followed him. Husbands who had once trusted him with their wives now saw him as a threat, and word of his scandalous behavior made him persona non grata. I heard he'd taken a job at a rundown gym, scraping by with minimal income. The charm and charisma that had once made him popular were now liabilities. People saw through his act, and he had no one left to fool. As for me, I was moving on. The divorce had been finalized, and I had full custody of the kids. I threw myself into being the best father I could, taking them on trips, helping with homework, and making sure they felt loved and secure. I didn't date, not yet. I wasn't ready for that, but I was starting to feel like myself again. One evening, I got a text from Nate. "Saw Helen at the store today. She looks rough. You okay?" I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. "Yeah, I'm fine." She made her bed. Because that was the truth. Helen had made her choices. She had gambled everything and lost. And now, as she struggled to rebuild her life, I felt no pity. She had ruined what we had, and the only thing left for her now was the consequences of her actions. For the first time in months, I slept soundly that night. I had done what I needed to do, and I was finally at peace. Life without Helen became my new normal. The house felt quieter but cleaner, lighter even, without the weight of her lies polluting the air. I focused entirely on the kids, my career, and rebuilding the life she had shattered. Slowly, I began to find joy again in the little things, taking the kids to the park, cooking their favorite meals, and listening to their laughter fill the house. It wasn't easy, but it was real, and that was all I needed. Helen, on the other hand, wasn't finding anything close to peace. Word about her downfall had spread far and wide. She had gone from being the admired stay-at-home mom to the cautionary tale whispered about at dinner parties and PTA meetings. One evening, Nate dropped by unannounced, carrying a six-pack of beer. "You're going to want to hear this," he said, a smirk playing on his lips as he plopped down on the couch. "What now?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Paul," Nate began, cracking open a can. "He's officially done for. Turns out he had a reputation even before all this. One of his old clients came forward. Apparently, he's pulled this stunt before. Got involved with another married client a few years back, and it blew up her marriage too." I felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. Guess he's been playing this game a long time. "Yeah, well, now everyone knows it," Nate continued. "He's out of work, broke, and last I heard, he was crashing on someone's couch in a dingy apartment." I leaned back, taking a sip of my beer. "Gut, he deserves every bit of it." Nate's expression sobered. "And Helen?" "She's at her mom's," I said with a shrug. "She hasn't reached out since the papers were signed. Not that I expect her to." He hesitated, then said, "I saw her the other day. She looks rough, man, like she's carrying the weight of everything that's happened." I shrugged again. That's her cross to bear, not mine. Over the next few weeks, I started hearing more about Helen's new life, or what was left of it. Elaine, true to her no-nonsense nature, had grown tired of Helen moping around the house. She'd given her an ultimatum: either get a job or find somewhere else to stay. Helen, with no work experience and a decade-long gap in her resume, had been forced to take a part-time job at a retail store. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid just enough to cover her groceries and personal expenses. Still, she was a shadow of the woman she once was, tired, withdrawn, and struggling to find her footing in a world she wasn't prepared for. Her friends, the ones who had once envied her seemingly perfect life, had all but disappeared. Most of them sided with me, disgusted by her betrayal. The ones who remained were too busy with their own lives to offer more than occasional pity. One Saturday, I took the kids to the park. As they played on the swings, I spotted a familiar figure sitting alone on a bench. It took me a moment to recognize her, Helen. She looked thinner, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. She was staring blankly at the ground, her shoulders slumped as though the weight of the world was crushing her. She noticed me after a few moments and froze. Her face was a mix of emotions, guilt, sadness, maybe even hope. She started to stand, but I shook my head, a silent signal that I wasn't interested in talking. Her shoulders sagged, and she sat back down, watching as the kids laughed and played, oblivious to her presence. For a moment, I felt a pang of something. Pity, maybe? Regret? But it passed quickly. I couldn't forget what she had done, the way she had destroyed everything we had built. I wasn't going to let her back in, no matter how broken she looked. That night, I got a text from an unknown number. It was Helen. "Tyler, I saw you at the park today. The kids look happy. I'm glad you're taking good care of them. I know I've lost the right to ask for anything, but I just wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. You didn't deserve what I did to you. I hope one day you can forgive me." I stared at the message for a long time, my emotions a jumble of anger, sadness, and something I couldn't quite name. But I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Paul's downfall was complete when he tried to start fresh in another town. I heard through mutual acquaintances that no one was willing to work with him. His reputation had followed him like a shadow, and every door he knocked on slammed shut. Eventually, he gave up on coaching altogether, taking a menial job to pay the bills. Meanwhile, Helen continued to struggle. The life she had once taken for granted was gone, replaced by a harsh new reality she wasn't equipped to handle. And while part of me felt a grim satisfaction at seeing karma play out, another part of me simply didn't care anymore. I had moved on, and her suffering was no longer my concern. For the first time in years, I felt free. Months passed, and the chaos that had once consumed my life began to settle into something quieter, something steadier. I was no longer the man reeling from betrayal, clinging to the edges of a life torn apart. I was rebuilding not just my home, but myself. The kids adjusted better than I could have hoped. They laughed more often, asked fewer questions about why Mom wasn't coming back, and seemed to thrive under the stability I was working so hard to give them. Weekends became sacred. Movie nights, trips to the park, and lazy Sunday mornings with pancakes and cartoons. I wasn't just their father anymore. I was their anchor. I hadn't heard from Helen again since her text from the park. She stayed at her mother's, kept to herself, and scraped by on her retail job. Occasionally, I'd hear whispers about her struggles, how the shame of her choices had isolated her, how Elaine's patience was wearing thin. But I didn't dwell on it. Helen's life was no longer my concern. Paul, on the other hand, had vanished completely. After failing to revive his career, he'd left town altogether. No one knew where he'd gone, and no one cared enough to find out. He was a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered among the same men who had once trusted him implicitly. One evening, after tucking the kids into bed, I found myself sitting in the living room, staring at the divorce papers I'd tucked away in a drawer. The ink had long since dried, but it still felt surreal. 10 years of marriage reduced to a stack of signatures and legal jargon. For the first time in months, I let myself reflect, not on the betrayal, but on the good times. There had been love once, real and undeniable. And while I would never forgive Helen for what she'd done, I couldn't deny the happiness we'd shared before it all fell apart. But that chapter was over now, and as much as it had hurt, I was ready to close the book for good. The turning point came when Nate convinced me to join him at a local fundraiser. It was for a good cause, he argued, and besides, I needed to get out of the house. I reluctantly agreed, not expecting much beyond awkward small talk and polite smiles. What I didn't expect was to meet someone. Her name was Emma. She was kind, intelligent, and had a way of making everyone around her feel at ease. We talked for hours that night, about everything and nothing, until the room started to empty and the staff began clearing tables. When I finally walked her to her car, I realized I was smiling, a real, genuine smile I hadn't felt in a long time. Thanks for tonight, she said, her eyes warm. It's been a while since I've had a conversation like this. Me too, I admitted. We exchanged numbers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt something stir inside me. Hope. Over the next few months, Emma and I got to know each other. She wasn't perfect, and neither was I, but there was an honesty between us that felt refreshing. She knew about my past, about Helen and Paul, and she never once judged me for it. If anything, she admired how I had handled it. You didn't let it break you, she said one night over dinner. That says a lot about who you are. Her words stayed with me, because for so long, I had felt like I was just surviving, clawing my way through the wreckage of my life. But now I realized I was thriving. I had come out the other side stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to build a better future, for me and for my kids. As for Helen, her life continued to spiral. Elaine eventually asked her to leave, unable to bear the strain of Helen's choices any longer. She bounced from couch to couch, never quite finding her footing. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had tried reaching out to old friends, but they had all moved on. She was alone, adrift in the world she had created for herself. I didn't hate her anymore. I didn't feel much of anything toward her, really. She was just someone I used to know, someone who had made her choices, and was now living with the consequences. One evening, as I tucked my youngest in a bed, she looked up at me and smiled. "I like it when you're happy, Daddy," she said simply. I kissed her forehead, my heart full. "Me too, sweetheart." And for the first time in years, I truly meant it. The past was behind me, and the future was mine to shape. I had survived betrayal, heartbreak, and loss, and I had come out stronger on the other side. Helen and Paul were nothing more than a distant memory, their lives unraveling as mine came back together. It wasn't just a new beginning. It was my beginning, and I was ready for whatever came next. What do you guys think of my story? Share in the comments what you think about the choice I made, and would you do in my situation.